May I start this session? We have another interesting one, and we want to get full time on it. We're only allowed an hour and a half. So let me, without any ado, introduce Roberto Zagha, who's talking on supply side constraints and inclusion. Roberto, please.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much to Anjini and to Nick for inviting me to this event. I was here 12 years ago. That was the last time. No, sorry, 2002, 9 years ago. And what's very interesting is what happened in these 9 years, even though it seems yesterday, which is the GDP of India has doubled. And this is quite an extraordinary event in several respects, not only because of what it has meant in terms of living standards, but also because of what it has meant in terms of ambition. I recall that when I was working on India in the 1990s, a rate of growth of 7% was something like a dream. And now in India, it's considered a policy failure if the economy grows at 7 or less. Change of expectation and ambitions, and which is very positive. So what I wanted to do today is put India's economic performance in context, observe some developments, some salient developments in the recent growth acceleration, some of which we touch upon today, and then the structural challenges, which I believe are the more pressing and perhaps also the most difficult. In a sense, financial sector is, I don't want to say it's easy to reform, but it takes kind of a clear blueprint. Retail is the same. It's a relatively simple legislation to change. But the other challenges are quite complex. They all require different interventions by a variety of actors. And so let's move on with that. So this is Indian context. Just to remind ourselves that India and Europe were at a similar level of per capita income 2,000, 1,000, and 500 years ago. Industrial revolution created a divergence in growth trajectory. More recently, 1970, China pulls ahead, and 1990s growth in the US and Western Europe slows and accelerates in India and China. So what we observe is a phenomenon of catch-up, particularly with India and China. And this graph shows you that India and China had roughly 60% of the global GDP, around 1,000. That declined to around 6%, a bit less than 6% after the Industrial Revolution. And then we have now a return to past trends. Just to say that if we were to sit here 300, 400 years from now in this room, what you observed in the last 2 centuries may just be a blip. This data comes from Angus Madison, that this was his last year, and he has spent his life constructing this long-term historical series of GDP. Last observation on growth. What's quite remarkable in India is that growth has accelerated gradually but persistently since independence. We had two centuries of stagnation between 1750 and 1950, and since 1950, per capita growth rates have started to increase very modestly at first in the 50s, more higher in the 60s, and persistently in the last 3 decades. And this is, well, made clear in this graph where you see the derivative is increasing over time. 3 salient developments in India's growth trajectory. The takeoff, which is relatively recent, is 2002, 2003. Takeoff in the sense of rates of growth above 7%. A remarkable increase in private investment and private savings. I don't recall ever seeing in the space of a few years such a jump in private investment and private saving in any country in the world. I look forward to Arvind's talk tomorrow, perhaps for an explanation. And another feature that we discussed this morning is a low share of manufacturing in GDP. We're all used to the idea that rapid growth experiences such as Japan, Korea, China are on the basis of manufacturing. What's striking in India, and we discussed it this morning, is that manufacturing is less than 15% of GDP in India, twice that amount in China, Malaysia, even more in Thailand, and it is comparable actually with the United States, which is a bit worrisome. So does India have a manufacturing problem? I think it's Anne and Mazumdar who invented the expression of missing middle. There seems to be a clear pattern of very large number of, it exists in many economies, but in India is particularly pronounced, very large number of small enterprises, very large number of large enterprises, but something missing in the middle. We can discuss on the reasons, which some of which were touched upon this morning: access to land, access to power, access to infrastructure, access to capital, and so on and so forth. So when we look at the challenges that India has, the first one is, of course, the demographic transition and population. It's an advantage in some respects. India will have declining dependency ratios for a while. And the number of women in the labor force is increasing and will continue to increase. And it will benefit of the transition far later than most other developing countries, China included. And this gives a relative advantage in terms of youth and labor force in proportion to the population. On the other hand, 43% of India's labor force is illiterate. This is very large. Just recall it was much larger 20 years ago and 50 years ago, and at the time of independence it was around 90%. Numbers of years of education per age group are relatively low. Vocational education and training are still a small proportion of the population. Right to Education Act, it's a controversial act, perhaps positive on balance, but we have to realize the private sector is no panacea. We all know that the quality of education in India is a very serious challenge. The learning achievements for students coming out of the primary system are very low. But what's also a fact is that private schools do not do much better, and in some respect, depending what study you look, they often do less. On the other hand, poverty has been declining quite rapidly, both in rural and urban areas over the last 60 years. Again, it was extremely high in the 50s, and now it's just above 20%. But what's most interesting is that poverty is becoming more and more an urban phenomenon. Even though the majority of the poor still are in rural areas, it's the proportion of India's poor living in urban areas is now higher than the proportion of poor living in rural areas. And poverty in India is just more than poverty lines. If you look at the poverty line, it's a relatively low poverty line. It's India's poverty line is $50 a day, and in current terms. But what's more worrisome is that even when you look at what can be defined as the middle class, meaning the households between the second and third quintile, all social indicators are very low, whether it's nutrition, whether it is health indicators, infant mortality, and so on. So this is reflected in the aggregate for the population, and this is an indication of malnutrition, which is a pervasive problem. Second structural challenge, agricultural productivity. Again, we discussed some of these aspects this morning. 70% of India's population live and work in rural areas, not necessarily in agriculture, but in rural areas. Agricultural growth has been at 2.3% in the last 10 years. Not very high, not very low. I don't think we can expect higher growth of agriculture, but this will qualify that a little bit in a minute. Productivity, very low, measured conventionally, meaning output per hectare, contrary to what Mark this morning was doing, which may be a more relevant measure of productivity. And rain-fed agriculture is a very large proportion of total area and characterized by low productivity, and more importantly, very little research and development, which has gone into developing the potential. As a result, the relative prices of agricultural commodities has been increasing since the mid-1980s, partly because of reflecting global trends, but also reflecting domestic demand. What's interesting is that in the last few years, what food has contributed significantly to inflation in India, and particularly the soft part of food, which is vegetable, foods, etc. But what is surprising, two observations here. One is that the fact that the yield per hectare is so low in relation to other countries gives an indication of the potential for increase, and therefore possibilities of much higher growth rates of agriculture than we have seen up to now. And I found it extremely interesting, but not yet fully understood, what happened in Gujarat in the last 10 years, where agriculture has grown by 10% per year. This is, I think, unprecedented, certainly in India, but unprecedented anywhere in the world. Gujarat is a relatively large state. It's not a small state where you have one monoculture that can increase relatively easily. It's a complex state. And so when one tries to understand the reasons for India's agricultural performance, normally we think about reforms, particularly in marketing, and that may be only part of the story. I think we had a very interesting hypothesis this morning, which had to do with the land and land consolidation. And the other is infrastructure, which some believe has explained the success of Gujarat. There's been, over the last 10 years, a very successful effort at improving availability of power to farmers, rural roads, networks of highways, and water, investments in water in the rural areas. And so I'm not saying this is the cause, but it's likely to have played an important factor. The other, thinking strategically in terms of how India's agriculture will evolve, probably the potential of the East, particularly Bihar, but also other states, has been underexploited. There's very fertile land, but its use is being eroded by regular natural disasters, particularly floods, but also the lack of infrastructure. Turning to another important issue is India is a common currency area, but not a common currency area in the sense of a natural currency area, but it has a common currency, so it's ahead of Europe in that sense. But in terms of having an integrated domestic market, it's not yet fully. There are a number of restrictions to moving commodities and sometimes agricultural commodities through state lines. Octroi still exists in Maharashtra. It has been eliminated in most states of India, but still exists in Maharashtra. And the Finance Commission has proposed, the last Finance Commission, the introduction of a GST, a national value-added tax, which estimates suggest a 2% increase in GDP, 2 percentage point increase in GDP at one time. Nonetheless, even though the reform has been announced twice in the budget, partly reflecting the difficulties of consensus making in India's political context, the tax has not been implemented. The proposals are relatively forward. It's a uniform tax across the nation. a number of indirect taxes and cesses will be integrated into the GST. It would simplify the tax system enormously. And the stumbling blocks of agreement have to do with, number one, the potential loss of revenue. There are some disagreements as to how much the states would lose with the rate that is being proposed by the state. Second, lack of agreement on how to tax mineral resources, and also states' discretion in granting exemptions and tax holidays. Many states would like to retain this discretion. So I think this is a very fundamental reform, but again, it's not a reform that any state of India can do on its own, nor is it a reform that the central government can do on its own. Fourth structural challenge, India's urbanization. We again touch upon this issue today. Just to give a sense of basic data, close to 400 million people live in India's cities, 1/3 of the Indian population. That represents a 30% increase to what it was 10 years ago. Huge infrastructure shortages. I think you just walk through an Indian city and you can realize all that is missing. Well, perhaps if you are middle class, you will not realize it because you are protected. But no city in India has water 24 hours a day, 7 days a year. The population living in slums in aggregate is about 1/3 of the urban population, 54% in Mumbai. But what's interesting is that the slum population, while large, utilizes a very small proportion of the urban area, 6% in Mumbai, and similar numbers in the rest. Now, when you see these numbers here, that very large proportion of Mumbai's population living in slum areas and a relatively low proportion in Delhi, it's not that Delhi has been more successful in providing better living accommodation. It's that Delhi has had a very aggressive relocation of slum dwellers, particularly ahead of the Commonwealth Games, but also historically. The population is expected to double, in urban areas, expected to double in the next 20 years, and more than 1/3 may be living in slums. So this is a graph which is actually had been prepared by a collaborator of Rakesh, Sumik Lal, which indicates the move of key parts of the economy moving into cities. And gross estimates indicate that moving labor from rural to urban areas increases productivity by a factor of 6 to 7. To obstacle to urbanization, one, there are no real city governments. If you look, for example, say the Constitution of Brazil, cities in Brazil have basically the same standing as a state government in terms of sharing of the pool of resources, in terms of the discretion of the mayor, and so on and so forth. In India, the cities are creatures of, and they are run by state governments. So all the basic municipal services are either provided directly by state agencies or by municipal corporations which report to the chief minister, not to the mayor. Cities have basically no administrative or financial power, and the test of the relevance of mayors in India is that rarely do we know the name of mayors of major cities such as Mumbai or Calcutta, whereas you cannot be in New York without knowing who is the mayor of New York. The second obstacle is the use of land, and this gives you an indication of, on the left you have Manhattan, and on the right you have Singapore, and what you observe is that the density of occupation of land can go relatively high, 10 meaning constructed area, 14 to 15 times land. And in Singapore, you observe the same. You have areas with very high density. Mumbai, this is Mumbai. You can see it's basically flat. The average is 1.3, as opposed to what you see either in Manhattan or in Singapore, where cities grow vertical. India has a tendency to have its cities, what they call chapati cities, they go flat. But at the same time, in terms of population, they occupy much less, Mumbai and Indian cities in general occupy much less area than other cities. This gives you an indication. The urban built area in 3 cities of similar population, Seoul, Mumbai, and New York. And what you observe is that Mumbai occupies much less land, and the reason is that the number of the area, the livable area per individual, per household is extremely low. It's one of the lowest in the world. Now, what explains the way in which Indian cities have evolved is very interesting. There are some studies that suggest that whereas transport costs between cities in India are among the lowest in the world, transport costs within cities are among the highest in the world, whether you count time or you measure it differently. And what determines the specific pattern is A, level of income, B, the design of public transportation, and whatever the specific combination that has explained how Indian cities have evolved, what is clear is that A, land has been made extremely scarce by regulation rather than by pure economics, and second, that it has forced a large proportion of the population to live in slums. And the third, as you may have read in newspapers, is always a subject of amazement that the rents in Mumbai or Delhi are as high as New York and or London, in some cases higher. So this is just a few comparisons of constructed area with in different cities with different. Okay. Okay, I won't elaborate on that. Other structural constraints: land acquisition, mining, and environmental regulations. Land acquisition is, I must say, I worked for about 20 years on and off in India, and it's only very recently that I came to realize how important and how problematic was the law of 1894, which essentially blocks or renders difficult all infrastructure work, which defines public purpose in extremely inclusive terms. And you realize it when you start reading a new newspaper every other day that there are conflicts over land and between farmers and real estate developers. You read in the newspaper the famous case of Tata in West Bengal. And at the beginning, I remember when I was reading about the Tata, the Nano case in West Bengal, I used to think, oh well, this is just retrograde farmers resisting progress and industrialization. And then you realize it's not quite that way. It is, they're very excessive and abusive instruments of expropriation that have been set in place. And India is one of the few countries in the world that I know where the state is a real state of private interest. It acquires land for private interest. So for real estate development, for malls, for industrial sites. And in the US, there's been some cases where the use of sovereign domain has been used in Connecticut more recently, but also a few other cases. They went to the Supreme Court. I don't know exactly what was the outcome, but it's extremely controversial. In India, however, this is a fact of life. The state, for a variety of reasons, the state expropriates lands, acquires it at prices often below market. And there's another complication. We don't know what the market is because you don't have a land market, partly because of the stamp duties which exist in all states, which are extremely high, make land market non-existent. So in the end, the land, the value is determined by a bureaucratic process, by an administrator, and of course it is arbitrary, and of course it creates, it can be contested in courts. I think this is one of the most messy areas of policy in India. It is, the license Raj continues to be very active, and there are two problems which I think are very serious. And there's a bill in Parliament now which tries to improve on the compensation and the equity aspects of land acquisition. What the current bill doesn't do is to introduce some economics in the process of land acquisition. In the following sense: one, the current regulations and mood in India still reflect the times when India was a country mostly agricultural and rural. And this morning we heard some comments to the effect that India was and will remain an agricultural economy. And it doesn't take into account that there are demands coming from urban manufacturing services. And the second one is that there's a tendency in the regulation to protect land, therefore, for agricultural purposes. Last, there's what is called the conversion of rural land into urban land and other uses, which is determined by state authorities, and which is very seldom granted. Therefore, there's an artificial restraint on the supply of land, whereas demand is expanding, and therefore you have all the elements needed to have an explosion on land prices. Then the states intervene to acquire land for whatever purpose in ways which are very untransparent, and I often think that land acquisition is where corruption, equity, and growth meet in ways which are not very productive for either one of them. Two other pieces of legislation are also problematic at the moment. You may have heard and read in the newspapers the case of POSCO, which has an investment of over $10 billion, which has been ready to be made for the past 12 years, and has not been made for reasons too complicated to mention here, but essentially India is trying to find a balance between growth and the use of environmental resources. And at the World Bank we face that every day. Every hydro project, every road project, every piece of infrastructure, we have to deal with resettlement and environmental groups. And it's very complicated because India, more than any other country, has a high density of population. So wherever you go, there are people and they have a voice. And India, we should not forget, is probably the only successful so far case of democratic development. I see Anne, who's threatened me with the next thing. So similar issues on mining, and unfortunately most mining resources, and India is very rich in mining resources, whether it's iron or coal or others, happen to be in very valuable forest land inhabited by tribals, and again that creates a problem. Last important constraint is power. I must say I never understood very well what happened with power. Because in the mid-90s there was a sense that India had found the response to the power crisis, which was unbundle generation from transmission and from distribution, create independent companies, create independent regulators. The fact of the matter is that 15 years later, it doesn't seem to have solved a great deal of the problem. The power sector now is facing an imminent financial crisis because regulators fail to behave independently. And I must say that when we had a discussion this morning about regulators, I'm not entirely clear why regulators have faced not only one state, but virtually in every state of India. And I always remember the case of the Electoral Commission in India. There was an electoral commissioner who took over, I think, the late 90s, Mr. Seshan, and transformed the Electoral Commission from a very dormant, perhaps passive entity into one which really changed the course of conduct of election in India, which are now, all the conduct of election is considered a model for other countries. So not necessarily all regulators are captured by the political process, and it's unclear why in electricity they have been captured, but the fact of the matter is they have. This is indeed it's one extreme of what's happened in other segments of infrastructure. So in concluding, often I ask myself, will India be able to continue to grow at the rate it has experienced in the last 10 years? And the answer is probably, and probably because I don't know why. I remember when I was working in India in the 1990s, I was often asked the question, will India grow like China? And my answer was always no, because of infrastructure, education, and design. I had a series of reasons why it couldn't happen. It did happen. And and I guess what's happening is that in the midst of all the confusion of the political parties, of the diversity of political parties, of very fractious politics at the central level, somehow the system over the years, and one has to admire that, has found ways of finding responses to the most urgent problems. So, because I don't know how to explain it, I'm optimistic things will sort themselves out, and that India will continue to catch up, and we'll see the graphs that was in the second slide. I'm done.
Come on. Okay. Thank you very much. We have two discussants. The first of whom is Sriniketh Nagavarapu.
Okay, so we received the slides recently, and so I think what I'm gonna do instead is keep my remarks really brief and just talk about 4 issues that I think are critical to this issue of the notion of this dual challenge of growth and inclusion. So how do we think about the heterogeneity of impacts in the process of growth, and maybe what are the feedbacks between those two? And in process, I'll kind of relate the issues that I bring up to Roberto's talk. Okay, so in each one, I think what I'll do is just kind of put up a key question that I think is my main concern in the area, and that could hopefully stimulate some discussion afterwards, and then talk about just some basic thoughts and some sub-questions that have been motivated by really interesting recent research in the area. Okay, so jumping right in, the first issue is this issue of entry and expansion, and we can think about this as agricultural firms, we can think about this as industrial firms. The question I have in mind is, whether the right firms are growing and expanding and entering into a sector. And right is in quotes there because it's hard to sort of define what right means. We have some notion of efficiency behind that in terms of which firms are best to enter from an economic perspective. But putting that aside, we want to think a little bit about, once we have this notion of what the firm structure should look like, and what actually determines that. And I put up finance and regulation here. Regulation, people can talk about licensing schemes, limitations on size that used to be in place a while back, and that study by Chari looks at some older regulations on size. Finance, I put up there partly because I think there's this notion, at least among the NGO community of like looking at microfinance issues, and the notion seems to be that you can get finance to a very broad set of people, and that'll grow firms and entrepreneurship in a very broad area. And the question for me there has always been, is that more conducive to economic growth, even from an inclusion perspective, than finding ways to target the person who can expand a business most quickly and do hiring. And so this notion of the missing middle, I think, is relevant when we're talking about really big firms. It's also relevant when we're talking about how you target credit, either from private sector credit from banks or public sector credit to much smaller borrowers. And it's not at all clear that you should be distributing credit evenly across people. And if we're thinking about private sector credit, we want to think a little bit about what might be impeding banks from identifying the people that are going to grow businesses most quickly, and maybe we come to issues about information and things like this then. The second issue has been talked about a lot already, is this idea that there may be too little migration in India. And again, we need to be careful about what we mean by too little. But there seems to be pretty wide agreement that there's much less migration than expected between rural and urban areas, and maybe also between occupations and socioeconomic class. And I put this question about institutional and policy impediments. I think that it's easy to say that limitations in infrastructure in urban areas may not be allowing for the right pull factors. Or that certain policies like NREGA in rural areas may be keeping people in place. And I think those are valuable things to consider, and then we'd want to take that kind of a step further and think about what the respective impacts of those things are and on who. So if we're thinking about heterogeneity of impacts and inclusion with growth, we want to carefully consider what's keeping different sorts of people in rural areas and what might affect changes in that sort of decision making. And so I've put a couple studies up here. There's one by Kaivan and Mark that is really interesting, I think, that looks at the role of subcaste networks and the insurance that they provide in limiting mobility in India. And that seems to be an important explanation for part of the limitations in mobility, and that has a very different implication for how growth might affect who's moving from rural to urban areas than policy changes around urban infrastructure. So I think we should think carefully about who is affected, whether that heterogeneity is in the income distribution or by caste or whatever, and who may respond to different sorts of policy changes. And that's going to say something about who's actually included in any new growth. The other study that I wanted to mention really quickly here is like the education studies by Anjani and Sheetal on the effect of quotas, and I think that says something important about the movement between socioeconomic classes, and also this study by Mubarak on Bangladesh, actually, that looks at limitations in movement in areas where there's highly predictable sort of quasi-famines in Bangladesh. And the question for them is, why isn't there more movement, and what can be done about that? And what they find is that very small cash payments actually induce people to attempt to go to a city, and that there's persistence in that. So even when the cash payment is taken away, people continue going to the city if they've had sort of positive outcomes. And so there, that has a very different policy prescription, and that's saying something about the possibility that insurance or some uncertainty about what the outcome is in an urban area is dramatically affecting people at the low end of the income distribution in rural areas. The third issue is on natural resources and energy, and this is stuff that's been touched on as well. The basic idea that I want to bring up, though, is that there's distributional implications of growth. The one concern is this sort of supply side constraint of whether or not we have enough power to support certain manufacturing sectors, let's say. Another concern is that that has implications for what's going to happen to the power consumption of other people unless overall capacity is increased. And we can think not only about electricity, but about natural resources like water, like this study by Pinar Keskin looks at sort of how industrial demand for water affects agriculture. And I think those sorts of trade-offs are going to become increasingly important. And we can think about other sorts of resources as well, like forest land. So that study by Andrew and Mark from 2003, for instance, has to do with forest land in India and how they find evidence sort of consistent with the idea that as income grows in villages, actually more forest land tends to appear in villages. And that effect, this sort of effect of needing to grow natural resources in order to meet the increased demand for forest goods that's coming from this increased income is critically dependent on the institutional structures that govern the forest land to begin with. And because maybe in this instance you have villages that govern forest land in a manner that's that's at least relatively efficient, you get this sort of effect. And so I think it's important to think about across resources, what sort of management institutions are there and how are they going to govern these trade-offs that increasingly emerge as there's more growing demand in urban areas versus rural, or one urban area versus another urban area, and so on. And the last thing is this issue of local service delivery. And my research in India has been in this area, specifically in the public distribution system, but there's this compelling question of why some localities deliver services more effectively than others. And there's this reference from Rithika Kara in Economic and Political Weekly, where she's documenting recent trends in diversion in PDS grain, kind of inferring it from NSSO data. And she sees improvements in diversion that they really stress. On the other hand, the amount of leakage is dramatic from the PDS, and the other distinctive thing is that it's very different across states. And so this isn't something that is just an aspect of the system, it's something that's sensitive to design of monitoring and enforcement in some ways, and thinking about how exactly that is important. And I think moving to something like a cash transfer system has a lot of things to recommend it. At the same time, it brings up new sorts of political economy concerns. And I think ultimately you can't bypass these sorts of political economy concerns. So if we move PDS benefits to a cash transfer, you definitely destroy some of the perverse incentives that are in the PDS system. And on net, it's probably a positive thing in a lot of ways. At the same time, all of a sudden now a BPL card is worth very much more, right? And so now you've got a BPL card that everyone sort of cares about a little bit more. So people who didn't care about PDS goods before and didn't care about getting a BPL card all of a sudden now care about getting a BPL card because there's this assured stream of cash that's coming from it. And we need to think carefully about the political economy at the village level to know exactly who's going to start getting BPL cards then. So if we move to a cash transfer, it's not going to preserve the current allocation of BPL cards, it's going to do something to that allocation, and the question is who ends up getting BPL cards under that new regime. One last issue I'd want to bring up is there's this interesting paper by Anjani in 2009 that has to do with central mandates also. There's this idea that this notion of how the central government or the state government interacts with local levels of government, I think, is going to be increasingly important going forward. And there's scenarios in which central mandates for spending on certain things can have positive effects, and scenarios in which they may not have as positive effects. And they find sort of positive effects of central mandates on spending in one dimension of goods, and so thinking carefully going forward about how to interplay central mandates with funding streams that go more towards local governments, I think would be useful. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Second discussion is Anoop Singh.
Thanks very much. Hope you hear me. Well, I'll make a few observations on all these issues that Roberto and Sriniketh have raised. And I'll speak on 2 points, growth and inclusion. On growth, I think Roberto ended with the sentence, will India catch up? I guess he means, will India's return to high growth come back? Make a few points on that. Firstly, I think the government itself doesn't think it should be taken for guaranteed. I remember reading an article just a little while ago by Montec, whom we all know. Montec said we should avoid the complacent view that since growth has been accelerating, it will continue to remain high if the policies that generated this growth continue. He's telling us not to assume it will happen. But beyond that, we've done some research on these issues, my teams, and there is some reason to believe that something is happening. We have a macro model that has estimated investment very well, but now it doesn't do so. If we look at recent investment in India, the model exceeds it. It means something is hindering investment in India right now. Probably some structural factors are at play. The issue is, what are those factors? Now, before I go into that, go into inclusiveness and inequalities, let me just say we should recollect what India's boom has been based on, certainly compared to China. It's very obvious, but let me just repeat that because I think it sets the stage for what I want to say. In that it's quite clear that compared to China at least, India's boom in growth has been much narrower in terms of its base, right? It's been in software, information technology, services generally, not in manufacturing. We saw this in the chart that Roberto put up. The share of GDP needs to go up, not even in agriculture. That's been, I think, a reality. And I won't go into those factors at this point. But it's worth bearing that in mind, because now let's look at what's happened in India in its inclusiveness. Certainly, poverty has gone down. That is well known. But it's, however, interesting just in poverty that in almost every Indian state, rural poverty rate is higher than urban, which probably, it's the opposite in China, by the way. But in India, this probably means that urbanization has helped the poverty aspect. But more importantly, let's look at inclusiveness and inequalities, which have been in the public debate all over Asia and also in India in recent years. What's happening with inequalities in India? The data tell us that by almost all measures, income inequality has gone up in almost all states in India recently. Now the issue is, do we know where it's gone up more than others? And I think the evidence tells us that a lot depends on the dependence of the growth of states on services. And what the data find is that in those states in India where services are a bigger share of the economy, those states have seen bigger increases in inequalities. And I just said that urbanization may have helped poverty reduction, but the data also tell us that the most urbanized states in India tend to be more unequal. Now, why is that the case? Now, there may be 100 reasons. I'm not going to go into that. But my team tells me there is some evidence that in states that have more labor market regulation, those are the states where their growth has been more biased towards services. And that is what is having the effect. So that was the one point I wanted to raise, and that is the structure of India's boom has real implication we need to come back to. But then, now having said that, let me now just move on to inflation, since no one has talked about inflation so far, and I guess I should. Now, of course, we all know the obvious. We know that high inflation is not good for most things in life, is not good for poverty reduction. That's well known. But our research tells us, I think what Roberto showed, is that the problem is non-food inflation. And what our research has shown us is that in both urban and rural areas, in both, higher non-food inflation adds to income inequalities. Food inflation is somewhat different. Higher food inflation can reduce inequalities in rural areas. The effect on urban inequalities is somewhat ambiguous. But the main point is the coefficient is larger for non-food than food inflation. So if both happen, it is worse for inequalities. Now, I needn't remind all of us what has been happening. And China is not a model, because we know in China inequalities have been rising too. So I'm not saying we need to look at China as a model, but just on this aspect of non-food and food inflation, you probably know that in the last 10 years, if you believe the data, food inflation in China has averaged 5%. Non-food inflation has averaged only 1%. Now, we know where this has been in India. In India, we know that food inflation accelerated and came down. But non-food inflation has gone up from 6% just a few years ago to close to 10% now, I think it is. So I do think we are seeing an important development in non-food inflation and the effect it has on inequalities. We won't see that result quantitatively for some time because data take years to come out. But from all the evidence point of view and the research we've done, we have to focus on non-food inflation. Not only has food inflation seeped over, but the research tells us that it is non-food inflation that is the problem if you're concerned about inequalities. And those were my 2 points.
Oh, okay.
And I'm done. I hope I'm...
Thank you very much. Okay, the floor is open for discussion. NK. NK?
Yes. Anoop, this question is addressed to you just for purposes of clarification. We keep getting very conflicting data on this issue of income inequality. And you have obviously the Gini coefficients, which you would have worked out in terms of both rural and in terms of urban income inequality. Is that data on the Gini coefficient contemporary enough for you to share this with us? Because I do recall having seen a study by the IMF which says exactly what you have now said. But there are a number of other studies which says that when it comes to Gini coefficients, it has not shown any significant variation to conclude what you have said, that there has been a rising trend in income inequality, because I think that it's fairly significant in terms of the implications for growth strategy and growth policies.
Other questions? We'll take 2 or 3 and then. Nasha?
A question for Roberto, and I was, some years ago there was an article in one of our papers that said Finance Ministry's estimates of growth not correct, and the actual article was about how we'd grown 2% faster than the Finance Ministry had actually estimated for the previous year, and I was reminded of that. In your presentation, where you pointed out all the constraints and then said, well, but we're going to catch up. So the headline, in a sense, was somewhat different to the core. And I'm wondering what what is the role, you talked about investment and the role that investment has played in India's growth, the huge increase in investment that took place in the 2000s. And I guess the question I have, do you have any idea what's happening to the capital output ratio? Since 1990 to now, are we seeing any change in the capital output ratio? There seems to be this underlying assumption that it's 4, and that we then transfer, we translate investment into output with that multiple of 4, or is there some change taking place that says that we're starting to use capital more efficiently, less efficiently, anything?
Other questions at the moment? Yeah, Mark.
It's actually a follow-up on trying to understand a little better the sources of growth. So my friends in Bangladesh, I've started to work on Bangladesh, which also, as you know, has a high growth rate that surprised a lot of people, say that a large part, maybe all, of the high growth rates in Bangladesh are due to the demographic dividend. They too are experiencing a decline in the dependency ratio because of a massive reduction in fertility and mortality, and an increase in labor force participation of women. What fraction of the growth in India over this time period since the 90s is actually just due to this demographic dividend? This is sort of getting at the question of how much is this in TFP improvements, productivity improvements, or investment, but how much of it is just this, they're benefiting only from the demographic transition? Can we give that proportion?
Okay, Radha?
I've heard none of the speakers really elaborate on the inclusiveness. The growth story, well, yes, I mean, the pathways are defined by some, left a little ambiguous by the other speakers, but the real issue is that how do we make it inclusive? And are there really any solutions in the short or the medium term to make that happen?
Yes, please. Over here. Wait till we get the microphone, please.
I have two questions follow on the inflation. I'm just wondering first, I'm wondering if the inflation in India is more supply driven or demand driven, and how about the development in the labor costs in India? And my second question is about the housing market, because you mentioned the CPI data in China. You mentioned the non-food inflation for the past 10 years is about like 1%. So, but I think that's not included the price development in the housing market. So, but that's part of the consumers, a big package of the consumer consumptions. So I'm wondering how about the housing price development in India?
Okay. Oh, Rakesh.
Roberto, I want to again raise the manufacturing question again, because I was surprised that in your list of concerns you didn't have that. And you didn't, manufacturing or industry. And you had put some numbers on it, that although now not even the Planning Commission is talking about 9% growth, well they are, they're still saying 9%, right? No, they're not saying 10% anymore. They're still saying 9%. So some projections that we had done earlier, that to get 9.5% growth over the next 9 to 9.5% growth over the next 20 years, assuming that services grows at about 10 for the next 20 years, assuming that agriculture goes about 4, which has never happened in the last 60 years, right? Even then, to achieve 9 to 9.5, you'll have to have over 10% in industry, which is about 50% more in terms of growth rate compared to the last 20 years. So how come that's not a concern of yours in catching up with growth?
Okay, why don't we let people, okay, one more question, then we'll let them respond, and then we can go to another round, I think. Go ahead.
Inflation question again. It seems like India has experienced high inflation consistently. What's the impact on inequality? That the inflation affect the wealthier or the poor more? And another one is related to the current monetary policy. even with such a high inflation, the Indian central bank decided to end the tightening monetary policy maybe 2 weeks ago. And what's the impact on inflation and on inequality?
Okay. Why don't we just go down the table in order? Roberto, we'll let you start. Take it, give it.
Okay. First of all, on income inequality, I think we should all remember perhaps the Kuznets curve. When you have a unit of labor that goes from the rural areas to the urban areas, the productivity increases by at least 6 or 7. So necessarily this implies worsening in income inequality. It's not a bad worsening, it's a very good worsening. So we should be very careful about just interpreting the Gini coefficient automatically. I think we need to have more elaborate measures of inequality, such as the median income of the lowest quintile of the population or the poorest 10%. In terms of concentration, let's look at the share of GDP that accrues to the 1% or 5% richest. I think we need a bit more than the Gini coefficient to assess in what direction inequality is evolving. Some worsening of inequality will have to take place until you have all this labor, low productivity labor, moving to higher productivity areas in urban areas. It's just arithmetic. See, there's no way to prevent that, and shouldn't be prevented. But we should be concerned about other indicators, whether it is the rate at which real wages in the lowest income groups is rising, the socioeconomic indicators of the lowest quintile, etc. So that, I think, is an important point to keep in mind. And Mark, you were mentioning Bangladesh, and I remember reading a paper which was saying that the most effective and powerful poverty reduction program in Bangladesh was Dhaka, for the reason that Dhaka had tripled its population, I think, in 10 years or 12 years, and the number of absolute poor had remained the same, meaning you had enormous people coming and loss of social mobility. And that's what cities do when you have a dynamic economy. On the impact of declining dependency ratio, I haven't done or seen the calculations. Arvind, I'm sure, may have done that in his book.
May I object? It was my understanding that the demographic dividend in India is about starting, that until then the young people in the distribution were increasing, so that it's just coming in now. Right.
This year or last
year? Yeah, very quick, very recent.
Yeah.
So it's not something that would have affected,
But I wouldn't know how much it will generate.
So that's good news, right?
Yeah.
So that's been built into the projections for the future, because then it should, it's going to be automatic.
It's good news, except for the thing that Roberto said, in terms of the very low labor quality. So it's not necessarily good news.
And it's good news if the government then changes policy so that indeed things can happen as they should.
By the way, I'm quite happy to abandon the Gini coefficient pursuit of mine. But since you are mentioning some of the other things, is there any robust comparative study of what you believe would be the indicators to assess whether inequality has worsened or improved?
Inequality has worsened.
Internationally accepted indicators of deterioration or improvement of income inequality.
I think we shouldn't look at only one. Now, inevitably, it has deteriorated, but I wouldn't interpret it negatively. It has deteriorated in the US, and that, I think, we can interpret it more negatively for other reasons. So it has deteriorated virtually everywhere in the world in the last 20 years. It's quite a remarkable common phenomena across advanced and developing economies alike.
Just on that last point, so we all grew up believing that Latin America was the worst region with inequalities. We look at data for the last 10 or 15 years, and you find that in most countries in Asia, including India, according to data available, Gini's and related, it has significantly deteriorated in many countries in Asia. In Latin America, it has improved in the last 10 years. this is a remarkable development. So something is working there. We need to study it. I'm not saying it's the traditional cash answers, but there has been a shift in the last decade between Asia, India included, and Latin America. Very interesting.
Yeah,
Is the urbanization cycle like?
well, yes, and I come from Brazil.
Yes.
And Brazil has had, I always am surprised by the impression that people have that Brazil is an economic success. Brazil was an economic success until 1980. One of the graphs shows that the per capita income of per capita growth in Brazil has been around 2%. It accelerated a bit in the last few years to 3% per capita. This is bad enough to stay where it is, where the US is. If you look at the US as a leader, it's not enough to catch up. So it has been, from a per capita growth point of view, it has been anything but a success. In terms of distribution, there have been some very powerful redistributive program. The Bolsa Familia is the most famous one, and emphasis on education and so on and so forth. But we should not forget that the Gini coefficient of Brazil, I think before Lula came to power, was around 56. Yeah. And whereas India, the last few has been around 38. So you start through a very unequal distribution, which has improved, came down by 4 or 5, but I rather have India increasing than if you ever ask me, in terms of, if you look at the real improvement in living standards in the lowest quintile, the lowest decile, it's a much better outcome to have a worsening Gini with higher growth and an improving Gini with low growth. Mm-hmm. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. The second thing in Brazil is that I don't have the numbers right in my head now, but I remember that once we had calculated the share of GDP accruing to the lowest 10%, and it was minuscule. I don't remember whether it reached the 1% of GDP. So you take a Bolsa Familia, which is a relatively modest program, which is about 1 or 1.2% of GDP. You distribute to the lowest 10%, you double their income or triple their income. It's a huge positive effect, but the income is not very high still. So my general point is that when we look at inequality, we are all looking for simple measures, and they don't exist. And we have to look at the dynamics and the evolution, what's behind them, and most likely we have to use several indicators to kind of make a judgment. On the capital output ratio, I'm really sorry. I used to know these numbers by memory, and it's a sad reflection of my current state that I don't. But they're easy to calculate, and I'm sure I can find them in a bank report. On inclusiveness, you raise a question on, every single structural constraint has both growth dimension and inclusiveness dimension. So infrastructure has enormous impact on living standards and inclusiveness, however you look at it, whether it's transportation or water or power. Just think of power and what power does to medium and small scale enterprises. If you walk through India, you observe that all the small enterprises have their own generators. If they cannot afford the generators, they cannot exist. And they are the ones who generate low-skilled jobs. So I think it's very hard in my mind to dissociate the big structural constraints for the inclusiveness dimension. I know that in India, people tend to think that inclusiveness has to do with the social programs, the Nuregas and the National Rural Health Mission, and et cetera, et cetera. In fact, good infrastructure has probably much more powerful effects on income levels, on living standards, and also the dynamics. The second aspect is, we were discussing this morning and recently, the job dimension and manufacturing. When you look at the poverty elasticity of growth, in China it is around 2. In India there are various measures, but it's always around between 0.8 and 1, which means that growth is much less powerful in terms of reducing poverty. And the reason is because it has generated, as many people observed, less employment. I didn't show, but there's a very interesting statistics about the skill content of export. And it's amazing. India has a pattern of exports which is more akin of a high middle-income country than a low-income country. And so that gives you a sense that the structure of the economy and the dynamics have not generated low-skill employment, which in China has been so powerful to take people from rural areas, put them in urban areas, and started a kind of a social mobility system.
So, Roberto, you don't see a kind of a divide,
A divide?
Well, you don't perceive a kind of a divide as one saw in the early days when, IT was getting introduced, and there was quite clearly a digital divide, in the sense that if one believed that if technology was, scale neutral and it went everywhere, everybody had access to it. Similarly, is it right to presume that if you have infrastructure in place and you have the basics in place, everybody is going to sort of make use of it, and growth will happen, and inclusiveness will happen? It's a simultaneous process?
Well, it's a model where we don't know all the equations, all the response functions. We don't know how the system operates. And what we're expressing here is kind of something born from studies, intuition, and you may do all these things and still growth may not happen the way you expected. That means that you miss something and you have to go on and look what it is, something. So I won't tell you that if we do all these things, that growth will inevitably go back to 10%, and I'll come back to Rakesh's question in a minute. But I would say likely. I was wrong before, I may be wrong again. But what's important is to think about growth in a dynamic way. I don't think we have a firm model about growth. We have some principles. We have to apply them, and if it's not working, you have to look for what's not working and why. Now, on Rakesh's question, I didn't put manufacturing, because I think it's a derived effect. But I may be wrong. It's a derived effect of infrastructure, and we know that lack of infrastructure penalizes small and low-skill industries much more than the others, because they cannot make up, they cannot internalize the gains of building their own infrastructure. Infosys doesn't need the infrastructure from the government. They create their own parks and satellites and water systems and whatnot, and they don't need transportation. So they're quite okay, but for most manufacturing firms, they need the transport and the water and the infrastructure, and as they are of a certain size, they cannot compensate for that. Or unless they produce something of a certain value, they cannot compensate for that. So I think what we see in terms of manufacturing growth, it's a distorted pattern that results from all the lack of infrastructure, and possibly also a very perverse regulatory environment where it pays to remain small in terms of tax authorities, inspection RAJ, and all sorts of regulatory burdens that fall on enterprises, taxation, and you name it. So I think that if these problems are fixed, manufacturing will pick up, but who knows? I think the last point, on inflation and inflation targeting. My personal rate of inflation is around 40% per year when I grew up, coming from Brazil. So when in India, I went to India and they told me, oh, inflation is 8% with a sign of alarm in their eyes. I would ask, well, what's the problem? So now inflation, but the fact is that, there's culture, there's economic structure, there's history, and it's a subjective criteria that 12% is now, the political system doesn't accept it. And for many years in India, there was this conviction that whenever inflation would hit 10%, then the government would get into action and fix the subsidies and fix the fiscal deficit in order to bring inflation down. But now what's very interesting is that there is no more only one constraint, there are two, which is inflation above 10% is unacceptable, but growth below 7% is unacceptable as well. So how the central bank will resolve that and how the monetary authorities will resolve that is not that clear. The third dimension is that it's not very obvious from the data how much of the current spurt of inflation in India has is supply is external shocks, the oil, the food, etc., and other supply constraints. So, not to mention commodities and iron and etc. So I think we're in a bad shape with inflation in India, A, because the instruments don't seem to be there, and B, because I think external forces play an important role. And short of stopping growth altogether, I don't see how inflation can be stopped. So perhaps we should just, how they say, fasten your seatbelts. I think that's it.
I should point out that Brazil and some other countries have cut their rate of inflation and accelerated their growth rate, so I'm not so sure it's quite that simple. Rakesh?
The highest growth rate India ever had was 2003 to 2008. It's also a time of low inflation. So this sort of canard is being spread that if you bring down inflation, growth will slow. I don't know how people can say that, right? On a sustained basis. Yes, of course, in the short term, that has to happen. If there is overheating of any kind, then a central bank action of increasing interest rates, of course, has to slow down inflation in the short term. Slow down growth in the short term. But the idea that you can sustain high growth of the kind that we've been talking about with 7 to 10% inflation is really strange, actually.
Okay. Sriniketh, do you want to add anything to this discussion?
Sure. So I think Roberto's presentation and Anoop's comments and Roberto's comments afterward have been really informative. The only thing I wanted to talk about real quickly was this issue of inclusion and this discussion about infrastructure that Radha had asked about. And I think maybe it's important to go back to one of Roberto's earlier points about urbanization and accountability, like this idea that we don't have a good sense of how local government is set up and how sort of the accountability lines run through in big cities and things like this. So I think that's going to be a key when we talk about where infrastructure is put in place, exactly who it benefits and why, I think will depend on that sort of local accountability. And if more than 50% of Mumbai is living in the slums and that doesn't get translated into infrastructure that benefits the slums, then there's a fundamental political economy issue there that I think is important to consider when we're talking about the inclusiveness. So I guess I don't think that just planting down infrastructure will help everyone, but knowing who gets helped by the infrastructure, I think is going to depend very tightly on clarifying who's accountable for different sorts of outcomes. And I think in a case like a big city environment, it's not, as Roberto's suggesting, I don't think it's clear who's accountable if there's low electricity provision in the slums.
Just 1 or 2 points. I think I answered what NK said as far as the evidence shows. I did make the point that in India, the evidence shows that inequalities have gone up more in states that depend on services. I did want to point out that we've done some of this research also in China. And of course, they're two very different countries in terms of what causes inequalities. But apparently, it also tells us that in China, states that are more dependent on services are significantly more unequal and have become more unequal over time. So it's not something confined only to India. And then the only thing I'll say is, from what the world is, I'm not a politician. So as Roberto said, politicians look at the balance between growth and inflation. I think the problem now is that inclusiveness, inequalities can result from both in ways we didn't expect. And I do think this is the real issue. I do think there has been a change in Asia in the last 10 years. And although inequalities may be higher in Latin America, I do believe there's been improvement. So there is some shift taking place. I do believe that shift politically is very important.
Thank you. We've got time for 2 more questions, and I see 2 cards over there. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I wanted to take up this issue of inflation, particularly what Rakesh said. it seems to me that in India we measure inflation by the wholesale price index. That index is highly correlated to global commodity prices. So I don't see how any impact of higher interest rates would affect this index until global commodity prices come down. Global commodity prices have been swinging wildly. In 2008, we had very high inflation in India. The Reserve Bank kept raising interest rates. We had a severe slowdown. I think we were more affected by the high interest rates than the global crisis. We were affected more by the boom that preceded the global crisis because that shot up our inflation. Exactly the same situation is happening today. The Reserve Bank is having no effect on inflation. They cannot possibly have any effect on inflation because 45% of these commodities are consumed by China. Only a slowdown in China can affect Indian inflation. Therefore, I don't think this interest rate policy can help inflation, and it is definitely slowing down Indian growth.
2 points. One related to inclusiveness and poverty, which also has a bearing on the morning's discussion. And one on productivity, a lot of questions on productivity, which Roberto indicated towards me. Firstly, in a 2005 paper, which, because it was taking too long to publish in India for various reasons, which I will not go into, it's in the Pakistan Development Review, which I calculated the amount of money needed to eliminate poverty, the transfers, and it was equal to the 3 largest central government programs in 2004. I very vaguely and briefly updated it for 2009. The same result applied. So there's a fundamental question here about our objectives and how we achieve them. I'll just leave it at that. The second point which come up today, in the same set of papers at that point, when I did a comparative analysis, I found that the bottom 10% of the population in India had the 3rd largest, highest consumption proportion in the world at 6%. This was for the 2004 data. So that's another relevant question. Just before to finish that, I think one very neglected thing is we focus only on the income. And I think the problem, really big problem in India, which we do not focus on, is the inequality in what I call public goods infrastructure. So the public goods are really the problem in my personal view. Okay, let's leave that there. Now, the question of productivity, there's 2 parts to it. One is economy-wide, where I have a paper with Bosworth and others, which is an NBR working paper, which came up with 2 or 3 results which are relevant to your questions. One was that TFP growth was highest in services, strangely, and compared that with China. It was completely different. Manufacturing we'll discuss tomorrow. That's what my whole presentation on the J-curve is about, so let's leave that. But what we found is that the biggest lacuna was that we are not getting the productivity growth from the transfer of population from agriculture to non-agriculture. So that relates to the structural problem. And finally, on the capital labor ratio across the board, it's increasing because much of the growth was coming from higher rates of growth of investment and therefore capital labor ratios. I'll just leave it at that.
Roberto, do you want to respond to any of that?
No, I don't know the answers.
Okay. Anoop?
I'll just make one comment or another. There is evidence. Of course, you're right about commodity shocks, but it affects all countries and not only India.
No,
but
it affects India much more because our inflation is commodity-based and not wage-based.
Except there is evidence in India that it has seeped over into what we call core or underlying inflation.
I question that also because, yes, those prices go up, but if you look at it from a macroeconomic point of view of the firms have to increase their prices when their raw material prices go up, but their value added falls. In the last 6 months, all Indian companies' sales have risen, prices have risen because of inflation, but their profits have been squeezed. So there is transmission, there must be transmission, because no firm will work at zero contribution. But there is considerable compression. All the raw material price increases not being passed on. And whatever wage increases are there are being compensated by productivity increases. You can see this because in most companies, salaries as a percentage of sales decline in spite of big wage increases. If you look at company-wide data, you'd come to very different conclusions if you look at the manufactured component of the WPI, because most manufactured goods have a very, very heavy raw material component. So there has to be some pass-through. But this is compressed pass-through. And only by looking at firm-level data could you come to this conclusion.
Okay. Okay, well, we've been very good, and we'll be well behaved, and so we now get our entire 15-minute coffee break. Thank you.